welcome to the next installment of What's the Deal with Vouchers? Our question in this video is, will education savings accounts improve student outcomes? You might recall this is one of the first questions we need to ask when we are considering if an ESA policy will allow Texas to carry out its constitutional obligation to provide an education to its citizens. Okay, so one of the primary arguments for offering ESAs is that students are more likely to experience positive academic and other outcomes if their parents have the resources to place them in the educational setting that is best for them. This is a good argument to focus on, okay? This really hits at the heart of one of the most important things in evaluating this policy. So what does the research say about this argument? First off, keep in mind that positive outcomes can include a lot of different things, all of which are important. So you could see positive impacts in the form of a student's academic achievement improving, they're learning more. They may be safer than they were in the other setting. They may enjoy school more and be more engaged. They might be able to participate in a wider variety of courses and extracurricular activities. They may just feel better rested and less stressed and just enjoy the experience more. Those are all positive outcomes that we could imagine students experiencing when they move from one educational setting to another. Having said that, most studies have focused on academic achievement because that's usually the easiest thing to measure with some kind of reliability. And even then, it's been tough because there were very few like apples to apples comparisons available. I'm not going to break down the research here because there's a lot of other sources that have already done that a lot better than I can. I will link to a few of those below, and I'll include a mix of perspectives, okay? But the short answer is the results of research on this question are mixed. Because the question isn't actually, do vouchers work or don't they? It's under what conditions do they work? So there are certainly some studies that point to neutral or even positive outcomes for students who use a voucher or ESA to move to a private school. From what I can tell, most of the effects on test scores are pretty modest, but there are some studies that show some more significant impacts like on high school graduation, college enrollment. Not super clear if those effects persist all the way through to college completion, but those effects are there in those studies. There are other studies that indicate students who used a voucher to move to a private school actually ended up worse academically, and that effect persisted over several years. So it wasn't just like they had a rough first transitional year and then it evened out. It was like it got worse and it stayed worse. There seems to be some indication that voucher programs that were rolled out longer ago in a single community on a limited basis have maybe been a bit more successful. There have been several policies passed in other states more recently that have actually opened up access to vouchers statewide with not a lot of restrictions on who was eligible to use one. And the results there seem like they are looking more problematic. So how do we explain these differences? What are the conditions that might make a difference between whether an ESA policy actually helps kids or makes things worse for them or doesn't make a difference? I can think of two big conditions to pay attention to. So first, there needs to be an adequate supply of alternative educational options that can realistically be accessed through a voucher or an ESA. Okay, so if there aren't actually any private or independent or other schools in town, which can be true in smaller and more rural communities, an ESA doesn't do you any good. If the private schools that are there don't have that many vacancies, or they won't accept certain students because of their academic or behavioral needs, if a parent can't swing the transportation to get their kid there and back, or they just can't afford the private school even with the voucher or the ESA, it's not going to be that helpful of a policy. Private schools are kind of out as an option. Now, homeschooling or virtual schooling still might be an option, even if you don't have access to a private school. But even then, the family needs to be able to afford for like one parent to stay with the child and provide their education or supervise their education or pay somebody else to do so. So there's still a pretty significant cost there that would need to be factored in. So if a family doesn't have means for any of that to work out, then having access to the ESA isn't going to do them a lot of good. The second condition it's important to pay attention to is, are there alternative options in the area that are at least as good or better than the school the child left? Now, if the child is moving to like a well-established, accredited, private or independent school with a solid track record, that's great. I would be less worried about them and would feel pretty good that they've got a good chance of, similar or improved educational outcomes. But this is still an important issue to pay attention to because private and home education settings are not overseen and evaluated in the same way as public schools. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later video. And that's a real concern because if you think about how the incentives around this policy work, there's a potential world where you see a sudden infusion of funding for private education providers that could incent some bad actors to set up like fly-by-night operations that can collect the state's money without actually providing a better education. I'm not saying that's always what has happened or what will happen in Texas, but it is a reasonable possibility that needs to be considered and mitigated against. And I would say it's a relevant concern for homeschooling as well. I will be the first to say there are a lot of home educated children who are getting phenomenal educations, and many of you are my family and friends. So shout out to all the amazing home educators out there. But the truth is there are other cases where it would be difficult to justify taxpayer funding to support like the version of home education that some children receive. So that's an important consideration for this question. I also want to note that this whole quality of service issue, like are they getting something better in their alternative setting? It's really, really important for students with special needs because private schools aren't subject to the same regulations as public schools regarding the educational rights of children with disabilities. That doesn't mean that they couldn't like voluntarily still meet those rights, but they're not obligated to. So important to keep that in mind. So as we look at any ESA proposals being set in front of the legislature this spring, and there's already at least one in the mix, we need to be asking a couple things. One, is it likely that the students who are eligible for this ESA will actually have real access to alternative options? And two, is it likely that those alternative options will be as good or better than the public schools students would be leaving? And keep in mind that if this is a program for our entire state, the answer needs to be yes across the entire state, which is a really big and very diverse place. Okay, so if the answer to these questions is no or I don't know, then the policy isn't right for us at this time. All right, next video, we're going to be tackling the next question that is important for us in this, in considering this policy, which is will ESAs help public schools and their students?